Chapter 21 of Ester Ried's Namesake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried's Namesake by Pansy. Chapter 21, Household Questionings. If the two home missionaries were jubilant over the coming of that home box, and saw in it a direct answer to their prayers, what shall be said of Ester's astonished delight when her portion of it reached her? She had been very brave on paper. Not once had she even hinted to the dear home people that every girl graduate save herself was to be arrayed, on commencement day, in white robes, while she, who had taken the honors, and who occupied because of this the leading place on the program of the day's doings, must needs appear in that one good dress which had already done faithful duty during 2 seasons. Because of her silence she fondly supposed, silly girl that she was, that her father and mother would know nothing about her embarrassments and be saved anxiety at least on that account. For the girl knew only too well how impossible a new dress would be this year, when traveling expenses must at last be provided for, and when there had been within the year a second retrenchment on the home board. And then had come, all unheralded to her, that wonderful box with its beautiful white dress remodeled by her mother's skillful hands, and laundered as only she could do it. There it lay, a mound of billowy loveliness smiling up at her, and being trimmed presently with ravishing rainbow hues, as Ester gazed at it through a mist of tears. Dear mother! Dear father! What had they done? How had they done it? What more could they possibly have gone without? The letter, with its story of Cousin Celia Westover's daughter Florence in mourning, came as a blessed relief. Ester both laughed and cried over that letter. "I will own, dear, that I have cried for joy over these garments," the mother wrote. "But don't be troubled, darling, they are not damp. It was before they were washed and ironed. I will confess now that we, your father and I, have lain awake of nights talking it all over, wondering what our girlie would do for suitable garments in which to carry her honors. We prayed a great deal, and we even hoped that a box would come different from the usual one, but not once did our faith rise to the heights of expecting one from our very own homes. Have I told you yet that your father's home people heard of the box and sent, each of them, a present to him? I don't believe I have, but I will get to it in my next letter. This must be finished to go in the box. Take it all in all, it was a strange experience. Do you know, dear child, I had to give it all up and be, at least in a measure, reconciled to your old blue dress, before the white one came. The bit of lace, dearest, is what my mother wore on her wedding day, and I wore it on mine. I will own that I was saving it for yours, dear heart, but it will be ready for that, and be all the more valuable for having served on such an occasion as is before you. Oh, that we were to be there to see! The gloves you are to accept with your father's dear love. He was so glad to be able to get them for you himself." It was then that Ester dropped the letter and let the tears have their way. Those dainty white gloves seemed to have embalmed in them all the toils and sacrifices and cheerful privations of the years. How brave they had been, that father and mother, in doing without her and doing for her with steady, cheerful self-forgetfulness! Could she ever, even in slight degree, make up to them what they had given and borne for her? But she had been fine on commencement day. 3 days before that she had written to her mother what she called its prelude. "Everything is ready. I cannot think of another thing except to do it, and for that I must wait 3 days. We are to be so fine, so very fine, you cannot imagine it, I am sure. It lies on the bed at this moment, and the class poem that It is to read lies close beside It. I use those capitals advisedly, and truly it seems as though It, and not I, was to read the thing. If you could see It now, Mommy, you would notice that It has a style about It that I never had. Assure father that the pronoun refers solely to the dress, and not for one moment to the poem, which, however, I must frankly own, is vastly improved by his criticism. Oh, mother, and oh, father, you both know how full my heart is, don't you? And then, to think that by next week this time I shall be on my way home! At last the day came when every lounger at the post office and corner grocery of the straggling little town knew that Elder Randall's girl was coming home, on the morning accommodation, and that the minister had already gone to the station to meet her. For by that time the railroad had decided to accommodate them with a station and 2 trains a day. It was an interesting homecoming, with features about it that were almost embarrassing. At first the happy parents were all but overwhelmed with the changes that the years had wrought. The girl had gone out from them filled with a certain kind of energy, yet shrinking painfully from the great world about which she knew so little, and with a sense of self-depreciation that was in itself painful. She had returned to them a self-possessed, well-balanced young woman ready to assume her full share of life's responsibilities. That they had expected. They had not carefully watched her mental growth through the years without realizing, at least in a degree, how she had developed. But there was something more, that curious something so quickly felt, so elusive when one attempts to describe it, which we sometimes try to define by the word culture, and sometimes add elegance, and know that neither is quite satisfactory. Whatever it should be named, it was Esther Randall's almost in perfection. But there was yet more, and this change became more and more marked as the days passed. No miser ever exulted over his gold as Spencer Randall exulted in the evidence of this kind of change in his daughter. "It is as though she has come into her inheritance," he told his wife. "She was a daughter of the king when she went away, I had never a doubt of it, but now she recognizes herself as of royal blood, and purposes to live up to her name. I mean the great name, Helen, that is above every other. But I am more pleased than ever before that we named her Ester Ried. I am certain now that it was not a misnomer." Perhaps, however, it was Aunt Sarah who was the most astonished over the changes in Esther. Or was it almost dismay that she felt? There was a sense in which she had lost a favorite occupation, although she did not realize that. Esther could not be nagged. Aunt Sarah's views on certain questions had not changed, and she boldly presented them, as soon as occasion offered, with an odd feeling that she must show her colors and not allow herself to be "put down" by this college-bred young woman. But although there was no indication that Esther's view had changed either, the arguments that used to make her eyes blaze with indignation, and call forth keen retorts from a well-equipped tongue, were received now with quiet air and a gentle, "Do you think so, Aunt Sarah?" Then would follow a change of subject skillfully introduced. "The girl has lost her spirit," Aunt Sarah told herself, but the explanation did not satisfy her. "Esther has grown pretty," she said to her sister. "I'll say that much for her. I never expected to see her carry herself with so much elegance and, well, what might be called style. To be sure, it is no more than one ought to expect in a granddaughter of Benedict Bradford. Still, with such a beginning as she had, I must say I don't understand it. She has been with common enough folks, those Victors, and even with them she occupied the place of a servant. It is really remarkable. I should like to have her cousin Lucia see her. I don't know how she, with all her advantages, can appear any better than Esther does." This was very great praise indeed. Cousin Lucia, the trial of Esther's young girlhood, because she was always being held up to point an ugly contrast, was the only daughter of her mother's only brother, who had married into a wealthy family, and had tried to keep his wife and children surrounded by the luxuries to which the wife had always been accustomed, and which she counted mere necessities. It had required, the home missionaries suspected, shrewd management on the part of their brother to maintain his establishment and lavish upon Lucia all that her mother believed she needed. But it had been done, and the cousin, who was a trifle younger than Esther, had always been the faraway star in Esther's sky whose brilliance there was no hope of equaling, at least in Aunt Sarah's eyes. And here she was being favorably compared with her. "She has certainly made the most of her poor little chances. Still," and her Aunt Sarah would make a distinct pause and bestow a troubled look upon her sister. On one occasion she gave voice to her anxieties. "Doesn't it ever worry you, Helen, to think what Esther is going to do with all that elegance of hers? It is simply wasted out here. There is no use in talking about Joram Pratt now. Though he is as good a boy as ever lived, and is just as completely bound up in her as he was before she went away. I must confess that sometimes it seems to me that it would have been better to have kept her right here at home, and had her marry him. Who is there for her now, out in this forsaken country, and there is no more prospect for her ever getting away from it than there was before she went to college. She doesn't seem to have found any one there. I thought at one time that Professor, what was his name, that her letters were full of, was keeping company with her, but it seems he wasn't. I don't see, for my part, what you are going to do with her." As a rule her sister had learned to meet all such remarks with good-humored indifference, pretending to pass them off as mere froth not designed for serious consideration. But on this occasion she had been much tried beforehand, and Aunt Sarah's bald and businesslike way of disposing of her daughter made her shudder, and drew from her lips the exclamation, "Oh, Sarah, don't!" and then she was instantly sorry. "Dear me!" said Aunt Sarah. "What did I say, I wonder? You couldn't look more distressed if I had been talking against the child instead of praising her, as I'm sure I was. I wouldn't be so silly about her if I were you. Of course the girl will marry, some time, if she gets a chance. I suppose you want her to, don't you? I don't suppose your heart is hopelessly set on her being an old maid, is it? Why, of course we shall have to wait for such experiences until they come. Who is proposing to do any other way? All I said was that there wasn't the ghost of a chance for them to come, out in this backwoods. She won't marry the men who are here, and those she would be willing to marry won't come here, and that's a pretty poor lookout. I don't think there is any occasion, at present, for you to act as though a great calamity had happened to you, just because somebody spoke the word marriage." The poor little mother thus caught and silenced could only be glad that her outspoken sister had not been able to see her heart and understand the meaning of her exclamation. It was not that she shrank from the thought of her daughter's marriage. She knew that the mother in her was capable of unlimited self-sacrifice for that daughter's sake. It was the realization of the life to which the child had returned that unnerved her mother. Aunt Sarah's words had sounded almost coarse and utterly hateful; the more so, undoubtedly, because there was in them an element of truth. Who is there for her out in this forsaken country? Not, who is there for her to marry? The mother's refined soul recoiled from such a putting of the serious question which involved a lifetime of happiness or misery; but putting all such thoughts aside, what was there here for Ester that was worthy of her? Work for God, plenty of it? Yes, and she rejoiced that her child had come home keenly alive to such needs and opportunities, and had taken hold of the work with power. But, who was there for companionship in work? Where could Ester look for friendship among those of her own age? She, the mother, had spent almost a quarter century here in happy service, but she had had her husband to lean upon. Could she have done it alone? Could Ester do it without one of her own age and condition to work with? It was problems such as these that came to trouble the mother's leisure moments. Was she willing to own even to herself that the girl's coming back heart-free had in it a shade of disappointment? She, too, had indulged her thoughts with regard to the professor whose name used to appear so frequently in her daughter's letters as to excite the interest of both father and mother, and then suddenly had almost entirely disappeared. She used to smile, at first, over that disappearance, and believe that she understood it. If the fond mother had owned to the thought of her heart, it would have been that surely no heart-free young man could come into daily, friendly contact with her daughter without loving her. She spent some anxious hours in trying to be sure, without knowing very much about it, whether this professor was just the sort of person she would have chosen for her daughter; then smiled over her folly, and admonished herself that it would be the part of wisdom to wait until she had something to worry over. Of course, there was nothing serious, or Ester would have told her. Yet it had been serious enough, and the only reason that the mother had not heard about it was that she had helped to instill in her daughter such rigid principles that she had not yet decided as to whether it would be quite right to share, even with her mother, a matter that had become, in a sense, Professor Langham's secret. CHAPTER 22.